Assuming you're not a sports photographer that needs to take a million photos per second, the Canon R5 Mark II and the Canon R6 Mark II are currently the best cameras you can possibly buy from Canon for hybrid shooting. Now I own both of them, and if you're anything like me, you're wondering, is the R5 Mark II actually worth that extra $2,000, or can you get the R6 Mark II and do everything you need to? So in this video, we're going to be comparing these side by side and hopefully answering the question, which one is right for you? And for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to say R5 and R6 when referring to the Mark II versions, because I don't want to keep saying Mark II 1,000 times. So rather than just rattle off a spec sheet, because anyone can do that, and there's plenty of videos already doing that, I want to talk about the main differences between these two cameras and how they affect you practically when you're shooting. So real quick, here are the main big specs that are different between these two cameras. The R5 Mark II has a 45 megapixel sensor and can shoot up to 8K raw 60 frames per second, whereas the R6 Mark II has a 24 megapixel sensor and can shoot up to 6K raw video, but only with an external video recorder, so internally you're limited to 4K 10-bit log. The R5 takes a CF Express Type B and SD card, whereas the R6 is just dual SD. The R5 needs the new Canon LPE6P batteries that look like this, whereas the R6 can use any LPE6 battery. And the R5 comes in at $4,300 US, whereas the R6 is $2,300. There are other differences between these two cameras, but these are the big ones that are actually going to really impact your shooting. In terms of the actual build of each cameras, the R5 Mark II has a little screen on top, the R6 doesn't. That's not really a deal breaker for me, but otherwise these form factors are almost identical. So how do these differences actually impact the usage of the camera? And are you going to be able to notice a difference in the type of photography you do? Let's first dive into why the R5 Mark II is better, because obviously it is a better camera. And then I'll talk about how the R6 holds up by comparison and why it's still a really great camera. The sensor is the single biggest difference between these two cameras, the R5 at 45 megapixels and the R6 at 24. The R5 is also a stacked sensor, the R6 is not. So does a 45 megapixel sensor actually impact your shooting on a regular basis? Well, for a lot of photographers, it won't. Having that extra 45 megapixels is really nice. Being able to crop in a bunch and reframe your photo and still not visibly lose any resolution is a really nice thing to be able to have. But most types of photos don't need it because you're not cropping in that much, and 24 megapixels is still a lot. So what about video? Now, most of us are not going to be shooting on this camera in 8K raw regularly. Some of you might be, but I won't be. So in regular use, both these cameras will be shooting in 4K. Now there is a big usability difference here because the R6 Mark II basically just has one video format you can do, which is 4K 10-bit log in a H.265 or HEVC codec. Now the final result in the video quality might not look a whole lot different between these two cameras when they're both shooting 4K, but there is some extra usability features with the R5 Mark II because it has multiple different formatting settings, where the R6 Mark II, you're kind of stuck in one format. Not counting in 8-bit mode, with the R6 Mark II, you're basically stuck in 4K 10-bit IPB in an HEVC codec, which means it's compressing the file down a little bit to give you a smaller file size, but you're losing a little bit of flexibility in what you can do to the file in post. And then the HEVC or H.265 codec is a great codec for producing videos with small file sizes. It's a really efficient codec, but the problem is that you have a scale when it comes to video files. Your codec is either going to produce a large video file that's easy for a computer to play back, or it's going to produce a very small compressed file that's difficult for the computer to play back. Because the R6 Mark II can only do HEVC, that means the computer struggles quite a bit to play back your video files. Now the R5 can shoot in that mode as well, 10-bit HEVC, which is honestly fine for something like YouTube, but the point is the R5 lets you choose. On the R5, you can also shoot in an AVCS codec, which is going to be a larger file size, but it's going to be a lot easier for the computer to play back, and it's going to have a little more flexibility with your editing. So if I'm just filming a casual YouTube video like this, I can leave it in H.265, and then if I'm shooting a bigger commercial project, I can switch over and shoot in a higher quality. So it's really nice that I can make that choice on the R5, whereas I'm just kind of stuck on the R6. But real quick, I want to show you this awesome new tool from today's sponsor, Artlist. So you probably know Artlist as the music subscription service, but they have a really cool new tool that you can use inside of Premiere Pro to speed up your editing. And if this had existed years ago, I would have saved so much time in editing. So let's say you're editing a video just like the one you're watching right now. This starts with a talking head bit. So I have 40 minutes here of uncut me just talking to the camera like this. And I need to cut this down so it's just all of the good parts. So if you come up to window here, extensions,
AI assistant. They have this silence removal tool, which means I can click this one button and watch this. Look at my timeline. Look, it's just automatically going through all the audio and cutting out all of the silences. And now it's so much easier to just go through what has been selected and remove the bad takes. This is the most boring, least creative part about the editing process. So to get it out of the way so quickly is awesome. But that's not the only thing this can do. You can also add auto zoom. So you know how you do punch-ins like this into your videos? You can also do that automatically. Not to mention, the entire Artlist library is now a plugin in here as well. So you don't need to go into your browser anymore to find songs for your videos. You can find them right in Premiere. Honestly, Artlist just keeps getting better and better. If you want to check this out, you can use my link in the description to get 2 months free when you buy a year subscription. But anyway, back to the video.
The last big video feature that the R5 has over the R6 is the R5 allows you to shoot in C-Log 2, whereas you can only do C-Log 3 on the R6. If you're not familiar with Canon's picture profiles, Canon has multiple versions of C-Log, and C-Log 2 includes more dynamic range and is usually reserved for their cinema line, but they put it into the R5 Mark II. So in practice, this isn't a massive difference, but it does mean I'll get some more dynamic range out of my R5 footage compared to the R6. So how does this all play out when you're shooting a project in real life? For photography gigs, I have that extra resolution on the R5, which is really nice to be able to play with, but 24 megapixels is still a lot. I've shot for the past several years on 24 megapixel cameras, and no one's ever said that photo's too low resolution. So it's not a huge noticeable difference in real world scenarios, at least in the types of projects I'm doing. For the video quality, these cameras produce really similar end results, but the options that the R5 gives you makes it so that you can choose a little bit more about what your post workflow is going to look like. Putting aside the 8K RAW, just 4K to 4K, the R5 will still look a little bit better because you can shoot in 4K fine, which is 8K oversampled to 4K. And you can also choose those other modes that I mentioned before that are also going to contribute to a higher quality final file. But for something like these YouTube videos, I'm still just choosing the HEVC long GOP codec on the R5, which is giving me those smaller file sizes that are a little less flexible, which means the video quality coming out of here is basically the same as the R6 because that extra bit of quality isn't super noticeable once we export for YouTube, and I just prefer those smaller file sizes when I can get them. But if I'm filming a large commercial project, I can switch over to 4K fine, and I can switch to the XFAVCS codec, and I can choose a format other than long GOP, and I can get some really high quality, really flexible footage out of this camera without even shooting RAW. Plus I'm still getting that extra dynamic range with C-Log 2. There's also a small difference between these cameras if you use an external monitor with these cameras for video. The R6 forces the main screen on the body to turn off if you have an external monitor plugged in that you're not recording to. When you do the same thing on the R5, the monitor becomes a preview window of what your final shot's going to look like. It's just a clean preview, but you can still use the touchscreen on the camera to control your settings. This is really nice because when I use a monitor with my R6 Mark II like I'm doing now, the only way I can see where the controls are is on the external monitor, but I can't touch them on the external monitor to change them. I have to use the wheels and dials on the camera. Not a huge deal, but it is kind of annoying that that's a limitation on the R6. If you use a monitor a lot for video, that might be important for you. All right, so all of that kind of makes it sound like the R6 is maybe not the greatest option, but honestly, that's not really the case. The R6 Mark II is a fantastic camera, and a 24 megapixel sensor is more than enough for pretty much everything. I've proven this because I've been using it for years along with my original R6, which is only 20 megapixels, and I've been shooting all kinds of professional gigs, photo and video on these cameras, and no one has ever complained about the resolution. Even for printing, with 24 megapixels, you can still print a pretty massive print at 300 DPI and have it look completely sharp even from like right here. So for most people, 45 megapixels is a nice thing to have, but you definitely don't need it. Then when it comes to video, yeah, the R5 has a lot more options. But the video that comes out of the R6 Mark II is still great. I'm actually shooting on it right now for these videos. I've got it all rigged out and I'm gonna make a video about this whole setup. But this footage is still really sharp. You still get a good amount of flexibility in editing when you shoot in C-Log 3. Honestly, I'm really happy with this camera and how it looks, and I'm gonna keep using it for video because the quality is there. My biggest real world issue with the R6 Mark II is how my computer handles the footage. I have a Ryzen 7 3700X for my processor and an NVIDIA RTX 2070 Super for my GPU. So a couple years older, but still not bad. I have to create proxies anytime I wanna edit footage on my computer because this footage is just so bad to play back. Because it's in that compressed file format, the computer has to work extra hard to play it back. So ProRes proxies every time Anytime I finish a YouTube video, I'm going to finish this video, import these files, and immediately make proxies. So proxies are an essential step in my workflow, and that's fine. But for big projects, when I have like 500 gigs of footage to create proxies for, that's multiple hours I'm setting aside to generate proxies before I even start sorting through the footage. So not only can I shoot in a better codec on the R5 Mark II, but I can also set it up so that it records proxies to the second card. So straight out of the camera, I already have my proxy files if I want to do it that way. But then everything else related to the actual final video quality out of the R6 is more so a nitpick. As you can see, this image is really sharp. I even do those little digital punch-ins on here, like to 120%, and you still can't really tell the difference. For a lot of projects, this camera is going to be great. Maybe not for large commercial projects, but at that point, you're probably looking at using a cinema camera anyways. So if you're a one-man band kind of shooter and you're a Canon fan and you want to keep shooting Canon, the R6 Mark II is still a really solid option. So before I tell you which camera is right for you, I want to talk about overheating. Yes, I'm dedicating a whole section of this video to overheating because unfortunately, this is still an issue with pretty much all mirrorless cameras. Neither of these cameras have recording limits anymore, which is awesome. That's super underrated. But that means the recording limit on these cameras is basically how long can the camera keep going before it overheats or the battery dies. So I ran a test to push these cameras to see what would happen. I've been shooting with the R6 long enough to have some real world experience with this. For long continuous videos, I basically never shoot in 60 frames per second and I don't really have any issues. I've shot hour-long wedding ceremonies, or I've shot a 90-minute concert set before where the R6 Mark II was going 4K 24 frames per second the whole way through. 60 frames per second on the R6 is a different story though. But that being said, I've used the R6 Mark II for weddings where I'm shooting intermittently throughout the day, but I've shot entire wedding days in 60 frames per second 4K on the R6, and I've never had overheating issues when I'm doing these intermittent recordings. How about the R5 though? It does have a leg up on the R6 in terms of features because it has the high temp auto power off setting. This just basically increases the tolerance for how hot the camera is going to get before it overheats. I'm just going to leave this on high basically all the time, and the R6 doesn't have this. There's also a physical feature that this camera has that's a one-up to the R6. They built the R5 Mark II with cooling vents. So now on the bottom and on the side, there's vents here, which are meant to be used with the new cooling fan battery grip. Goes on the bottom and it shoots cold air through these vents. So that is going to increase the recording time on this camera by a good amount. I didn't buy it because it's a big form factor change and it's also another $400 US on top of what you're already paying for this camera. So if I can get away without it, I'm going to, but it is important to note that it exists. Okay, so how did this test pan out? I started both cameras recording at the same time. They're both doing 4K 60 10-bit with IPB compression in the H.265 format. I'm recording in my home office, which is around 71 degrees Fahrenheit. The R5 high temp setting is set to high, and this isn't an option on the R6. At about 30 minutes into recording, we can see that both cameras are starting to have the overheating warning pop up on the screen, but the R5 only has a couple of the bars full, whereas the R6 is a lot higher. At 38 minutes, both of the cameras are still going, but now the R6 has reached full bars on the heat warning. The R5 is giving us a warning that the body is hot to touch, but touching the backs and handles of both of these cameras, they feel about the same temperature to the touch. Not burn territory, but definitely uncomfortable to hold. Finally, at 40 minutes and 22 seconds, the R6 shuts down due to overheating, and the R5 makes it all the way to an hour and 2 minutes before overheating as well. This is about what I expected, and honestly, I'm fine with it because when recording in a constant stop and start scenario like I do frequently, I never have a problem on the R6 Mark II. It's never come up once. And anytime I'm shooting a long recording video like a wedding ceremony or talking head for interview or a podcast or something like that, there's really no need for 60 frames per second. So I'm at 24 and again, I don't have any overheating issues. I'm sure people do it, but I can't imagine a scenario where you would need 60 frames per second for like a talking head kind of thing to just roll for like an hour. So yes, these cameras overheat. The R5 lasted longer than the R6, but realistically, you're not going to run into this issue very often with both of these cameras. And on top of that, they both give you a warning well in advance before they actually finally overheat. And if you're one of the few people out there that would still overheat these cameras, then you should probably be looking at a cinema camera anyways. All right, I think I've covered all my bases. So which one of these cameras is right for you? There are still a few features that the R5 has that the R6 doesn't that I didn't cover in this video, but that's because I mainly wanted to go over the practical stuff that's really going to affect you when you're actually shooting. So who should cash out on the R5 Mark II and who can rest easy knowing they saved $2,000 that they didn't need to spend on the R6 Mark II. The R5 is very clearly built for professional photographers who also do video work and are earning a living using this camera. The R6 has a lot of great professional features, but is more limited compared to the R5 and is more targeted as a prosumer enthusiast camera, although it absolutely can be used professionally. So unless you've got a ton of cash to drop on your hobbies, the R5 Mark II is pretty much exclusively for professionals who are going to be using this to earn a living. If you want the cutting edge, best possible camera for your work and you're making enough money from your business that it makes financial sense to spend $4,300 on a camera body, then the R5 is absolutely the camera for you. It's an amazing camera. Although it's not perfect, it's the single best hybrid camera that Canon currently makes. And on the video side, it even begins to compare to cinema cameras like the R5C or the Canon C80. And this is why I personally bought it. It's an amazing photography camera that can also shoot amazing videos. And that fits perfectly with the type of work that I do to make a living. The R6 Mark II is either for a high-end hobbyist or a professional who's maybe in the earlier years of their career and could benefit a lot by saving that extra couple $1,000s for features that they don't necessarily need. It still captures outstanding photos. The video quality is more than enough to deliver high quality videos for professional work. So if you're like most photographers and you don't need the 45 megapixels, or maybe you don't shoot video enough for you to be concerned about all of the different codec options and stuff, then the R6 Mark II might just be the perfect camera for you. You can save yourself that $2,000 and maybe buy a nice L lens instead. Actually, the VCM lenses that Canon has been releasing, the 24 1.4, the 35 1.4, and the 50 f1.4 VCM lenses, all come in at under $2,000. So you can get an R6 Mark II and say a 50 f1.4 prime lens, a really good lens, for still less than just the R5 Mark II body costs. So that is something to consider. There's also a third option you should think about if you're watching this in early 2025. The Canon R6 Mark III is yet to be announced, but we should be seeing it in 2025 or at the very least early 2026. We don't know all the specs of this camera, but it's very likely it'll solve a lot of the problems that the R6 Mark II has compared to the R5 and will maybe bridge that gap a little bit more for probably about the same price that the R6 Mark II currently is. So if you're in a position where you can wait and you're leaning more towards the R6 Mark II, but you're not sure, it might be worth waiting it out an extra few months to see what happens. But if you need a camera like literally right now, then don't worry about waiting. But you know, it is coming soon and that's something worth noting. The main thing I want you to take away from this video is this. The R5 Mark II is about twice the price of the R6 Mark II. But in practical use, it's not 2 times better. This is called diminishing return and it applies to all things camera gear. The more money you spend, the less bang for your buck you're going to get as you get higher and higher. So the R6 Mark II is a fantastic bang for your buck camera, but the R5 Mark II is just the best hybrid camera you can buy from Canon, period. So decide for yourself what's more important. Value for your dollar or just having the best possible thing you can possibly have regardless of the cost. Personally, I'm going to be using the R5 Mark II as my A cam and my R6 Mark II as my B cam, or I might do setups where I have the R6 as my video camera and the R5 as my photo camera. Depends on the project, but I will be keeping both of these cameras and using them regularly. So I'll make a follow-up video in a few months or maybe a year and see where we're at, see if I'm still liking both these cameras and how well they work together. But that's all I got for you in this video. If you like this video, consider hitting the like button, really helps me out, or subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this. I'm gonna link both these cameras down in the description along with all my other camera gear if you want to check that out. But that's all I got for you. Thank you guys for watching and I'll catch you in the next one.